Welcome to the Quillette podcast. Today's guest is Joan Smith, whom our Quillette readers will know from her detailed and scathing articles about the state of gender politics in Scotland, including her most recent offering, which appeared on August 4th under the title Gaslighting Scottish Rape Victims in the Name of Trans Inclusion. In that article, Joan brought readers up to speed on the bizarre situation at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, which has been overseen in recent years by a trans-identified biologically male CEO named Midel Wadwa. As Joan will discuss, Wadwa was recently suspended from his job, or possibly fired, it's not clear which, following a number of scandals. These included Wadwa's bullying of a rape crisis counselor named Roz Adams, who'd asked questions about why clients at the Rape Crisis Centre weren't being given honest information about the fact that the center was being run by a man. Thanks to the center's obsessive fixation on transgender inclusion, moreover, a subsequently convicted male sex offender named Cameron Downing was allowed to access the center's services on the claim that he wasn't really a man, but actually non-binary. As we will discuss, these scandals at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre reflect a larger pattern in Scotland. Under former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who resigned in 2023, Scotland enacted a number of highly controversial policies in the name of trans inclusion, including putting violent male rapists in female prisons. Once again, Joan Smith's article appeared in Quillette on August 4th under the title Gaslighting Scottish Rape Victims in the Name of Trans Inclusion. She spoke to me earlier this week from London, England. Joan Smith, thanks for being on the Quillette podcast. My first question is very basic. How do you pronounce the name Midel Wadwa?
Well, that's more or less it. Yeah, it's Midel Wadwa.
Okay. I assumed I was hideously butchering it, as I often do with names from all around the world. So how did this person become the head of, at the time, am I correct, that it was Edinburgh's only rape crisis centre?
I think it was the only one. It was certainly the best known by far, since it was set up by women for women. And the job of running the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, the CEO job, was advertised as open to women only. And he applied, and he always wears women's clothes, and he presents himself as a woman. And he did actually, in a podcast, say that he applied for the job, didn't reveal his biological sex, was offered the job. And it was only at that point that the people who interviewed him discovered that he was actually a biological male. And at that point, they were legally entitled to withdraw the job offer because, they'd been clear that it was only open to women. And there is an exemption under the Equality Act 2010, which allows certain jobs to be for a person of particular biological sex. But he was quite well known in those circles by then, because I think he'd been around in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and the area since about 2005, working in the violence against women and girls sector and presenting as a woman. And I think they were impressed, and they decided to go ahead and give him the job.
This may sound like an extremely naive question, but I'm going to ask it. Is there any precedent for a man taking on a job like this? Because I can see a situation in which a man with experience in this field presents himself in good faith and with full transparency after serving for years or decades in the rape crisis field and getting the job with the support of staff and board members. To your knowledge, has that happened in Scotland?
I don't know myself that that's happened, but it's worth saying that there are very few men working in this field. The rape crisis movement in this country, rather like domestic violence refuges, was really set up outside the state by women because there wasn't provision for women who suffered from domestic and sexual violence. So it was very much a kind of offshoot of 1970s feminism, that women got together, found the money to acquire, rent or buy accommodation. And of course, the services generally are single sex, because if you ask a woman who's been raped and maybe viciously beaten or assaulted over a period of years, on the whole, she finds it quite difficult to talk about that experience. And most women find it easier to talk to other women. So I wouldn't expect many men working in this field at all.
Typically at a rape crisis counseling center, someone would come in and, as I understand it, the intake procedure and also the counseling procedure they might find themselves alone in a room with a counselor in a vulnerable context. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, there's basically two different kinds of counselling. So sometimes women find it easier to talk in a room with other women who've gone through similar experiences, so they don't feel personally quite as exposed. But even in that context, I think rape victims would usually expect the other victims to be female and the discussion to be led by a female counsellor. The other model is a one-to-one situation where the woman actually sits in a room on her own with the counsellor who is female, so she feels in a position where she feels she can trust another woman.
So we had a situation here in Canada, in Vancouver, and this is a situation that goes back to the 90s, well before the current, call it mania for intersectional feminism or gender identity, that sort of thing, where you had a biological man who pretty much dedicated his life to seeking access to, I think it was a volunteer job at a rape crisis center, I think was rejected. And then after being rejected, kind of went on this vengeance streak against the rape crisis center. It became clear from the sheer viciousness of the campaign against the rape crisis center that this was a guy who saw his entree into the ranks of rape crisis counselors as like an essential hallmark of his desire to be treated as a woman. And there was something kind of pathological about it. I don't get the sense Midel has that kind of personality, like doesn't seem sociopathic or anything like that. Is it possible that Midel is in good faith seeking to help women?
The purpose of a rape crisis center is not to make people who have a tenuous grasp of their what they would call their gender identity. It's not to make them feel better. It's to help women who've suffered from male violence. I don't know what Midel's motivation was. Certainly, I can see that one of the things he got was a lot of validation. He was treated as a woman. His self-presentation was accepted, and he was allowed a position of great influence and I would say quite some power in a movement where he was seen as both, an outsider, a woman of color, somebody who dedicated his life to this work. So he got a lot of validation from it, and he got a lot of power and influence. And that's not, from my point of view, what a rape crisis center exists for.
During the editing process on your article, and spoiler alert, I was your editor, we had a kind of side discussion about intersectionality, which we didn't get into in the article. My understanding is your views on intersectionality and intersectional feminism are somewhat nuanced, and we didn't want to turn your piece into a culture war polemic about that. However, I will glancingly say that, as most listeners will know, intersectional feminism does assign pride of place in the marketplace of ideas to people who have multiple markers of the common word used here is oppression. So in the case of Midel, somebody who is trans-identified, somebody who is an immigrant, born and raised in India. It seems that in Scotland, as in other English-speaking countries, the sort of stacking up those badges of intersectional identity is sort of like a ticket to hyperspace yourself into at least the mid-echelons of left-of-center politics. Has that been the case with Midel?
Yes, I mean, he certainly did want to have a political career, and he tried to be selected to stand for the Scottish National Party, the SNP, as a candidate for the Hollywood Parliament, which is
regional Scottish National Parliament.
So he had political ambitions. My problem with intersectionality is that I think it started out several decades ago as an interesting idea, but I think at a time when the left has become very polarized. I mean, so has the right, but so has the left. And so it is almost like if you can claim 2 or 3 different kinds of identity, including trans identity and an immigrant background and so on, I think it inclines people on the left to look on you more kindly. It's probably to your advantage.
Putting that to one side, this is a general question, but you covered it in a great 2023 article, which was about the more general question of how Scotland, even by the standards of other English-speaking areas of the world, became particularly enraptured with what some people call gender ideology, gender identity, the idea that men can become women by simply declaring as such. You mentioned the SNP, which I think most of the world knows as a sort of nationalist movement. And it's kind of odd because nationalist movements we tend to associate sometimes with right-wing reactionary, Hungary or Russia, where are kind of like
Yeah.
anti-LGBT, if I can use those four letters together. Could you give us a thumbnail description of how the SNP, again, a nationalist party, did go all in on this gender movement? How did this happen?
The SNP is slightly unusual in terms of nationalist parties because it's always tended to be left of centre. And after 2015, it became the largest party in the Scottish Parliament, and so the First Minister was Nicola Sturgeon was an SNP minister. I think they were very open to all kinds of wacky ideas. From 2015, they were really in a position of power, but they didn't quite have a majority, and they formed a coalition with a bunch of Green politicians in Scotland who really are very, very wacky indeed. The Green SNP coalition really embraced the whole transgender movement. And you have to understand that both there and in England and Wales, there's been a concerted push by activists to take over certain parts of the state and also the charity sector. So we know, for example, that a trans group more or less wrote prison policy in Scotland, and this was in around 2009, 2010. And they explicitly tried to change prison policy so that men who went to prison for serious offences, including rape, who identified as women, would be moved into the women's estate and they would be put in women's prisons. And their rationale for that was probably one of the hardest tricks to win. And if you could do that, you could do the same elsewhere. And I think the rape crisis movement was another target. These are organizations which deal with very, very vulnerable women who are in prison, women who are separated from their children, women who've been raped. If you can actually embed gender identity into organizations like that, the rest will probably fall into line. And that's what they were doing. And that's what the SNP Green Coalition allowed.
Even before the current scandal, or set of scandals, which we'll get to, involving the Rape Crisis Center, there was a completely separate scandal involving this person and their tenure at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Center, because I believe it was in a podcast. The language is somewhat veiled, but as I understand it, I think this is 2023, Midel said when women come to the Rape Crisis Center, they may have all these preconceptions about the male body and being with male bodies and their traumatic experiences. We might have to reframe that trauma in an ideologically correct way. And once you waded through all the jargon, which is something of a chore, I must say, you realize that what this person is saying is we have to alter this traumatized person's view so that they take a more positive view of trans women who have penises and look exactly physically and biologically like the person who raped these people. Is that correct?
What he actually said was something along the lines of, we know that bigoted people get raped as well. And women are not going to a rape crisis centre saying, I was attacked, it was terrible, and I have bad feelings about male-bodied people as a result, but I would like you to help me get over. What they're trying to do is actually, get their lives back on course after suffering horrendous male violence. And so what he was doing was turning a personal ordeal into an ideological battlefield. So he was saying that, our job is not just to counsel these women and help them come to terms with what's happened. It's also to change their ideas about transgender people, about men, and so on. And that is an absolutely extraordinary change from the reason that rape crisis centres were set up in the first place. I mean, you have to remember that women who come to a rape crisis centre, they may have been raped several times. They may have been raped by several men. They may have suffered horrendous violence. They may have been raped by a partner or an ex-partner. They are dealing with some of the most traumatic experiences that a woman can go through. And to say that you've actually got to think about this in a different way, which is to stop being so afraid of men. The reason that women are afraid of men is a very good one, because most violence against women is committed by men. So this was a huge departure from what rape crisis centers usually do.
What's kind of shocking to me, though, is how this person kept their job. Like, I'm trying to imagine you ran like an anti-racism center, and let's say the staff were black, but somehow you're a white person and you became the head of an anti-racism center, and you gave an interview and said, a lot of people who come to our center who are victimized by neo-Nazis, they have all these preconceptions about, the Nazi regime, and part of my job is to educate them about German history and stuff like that. Like, that person would be fired immediately. Like, how did Midel keep his job?
They could have said, we're disturbed by your approach to your job, we're not very happy about this. But you have to understand just how, we use the word captured here, how captured the rape crisis sector is by trans ideology. It really has penetrated all levels of civic society in Scotland. And so you'd actually not find, I think, many women at a senior level in the rape crisis movement in Scotland who actually found anything wrong with what he was saying.
That's insane.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we're on the same page. And I think the interesting subplot here is that the name of the podcast was actually called The Guilty Feminist. Is that correct? Yeah, that's too perfect. Why would anyone listen to that podcast? But let's get into the current scandal, such that Midel has since been suspended. It's possible fired. This story, to some extent, has a hero. This is someone who came to the Rape Crisis Center, was hired on, as I understand, a rank and file counselor. And how did they prevail?
She's called Ros Adams, and she came to work for the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre around the time that Midel Wadhwa was appointed, and was very clear that she wasn't in any way anti-trans people. She'd worked in Glasgow previously, had worked quite happily with trans-identified people. But when she began to work at the Rape Crisis Centre, what was happening was several things, but a member of staff decided to identify as non-binary. And this member of staff changed her first name to a name that sounded male. This raised questions with service users because they were being told, your counsellor is this person. And looking at the name, they thought the person was male. So they started asking, can you assure me that, that my counsellor will be female? So Ros Adams was asking her seniors, including Midel Wadhwa, what do I tell this woman? And in the end, she was told, you have to say that there are no men working at the centre. Now, that wasn't true because the CEO is a man. There was a disciplinary process against her, accusing her of transphobia, which went on for ages and ages and ages. And eventually she resigned and went to an employment tribunal where she won very comprehensively. That, that the decision of the tribunal was that she had been given no choice but to leave her job because of the discrimination that she'd suffered. And that's what the tribunal called it, discrimination for her gender critical views. And then later on in this saga, a woman in her 60s approached the centre, and she had been raped 40 years ago, and she wanted to join a group to talk about her experience for the very first time. And she raised the question, could she be sure that she'd be in a room full of women? And what she was told was that the centre wasn't the place for her. And so Ros Adams was getting more and more worried by the way in which service, because the Rape Crisis Centre is there to provide services for rape victims. It's not there to validate somebody who decides they're non-binary or whatever.
Right.
And Ros Adams was getting more and more worried about this. And because she was asking all these questions, and she discovered that people who had queried whether there were men working at the centre, people who'd sent emails asking why Midel Wadhwa, who is a man, was in charge of the centre, their emails were being filed in a folder called hate mail. So, there was a very clear bias against anybody who was asking questions, whether they were working the centre or whether they were people who wanted to use services, that all of that, any questions about this, they were being smeared as hatred, and that women were actually being misled about who was working at the centre. So eventually, after a very long process, disciplinary process. The centre found that Ros Adams had breached the disciplinary process.
This is the internal, quote unquote, disciplinary process within
right.
the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, a centre that's presided over by Midel. So I just want to make that distinct from the tribunal process,
Yes.
which followed that. The term that the actual tribunal later used to describe the internal workings at the Rape Crisis Center was, I believe, Kafkaesque, and I think they used the term heresy hunt.
The internal disciplinary process decided that Ros Adams had been transphobic, but they decided they would take no action because it had dragged on for so long. I mean, even they were embarrassed by how many months this had taken. And Ros Adams at this point decided she couldn't go on working there, so she resigned. And she then went to an employment tribunal. And we know all of this because the employment tribunal, the centre had to produce a huge quantity of documentation. And what's astonishing about it is just the amount of time they all spent emailing each other about things like, protecting the non-binary identity of staff members and things like that. It was a very inward, incestuous sort of process.
So this is worth noting that they're in the business of protecting women from getting raped and protecting the emotional state of traumatized women who have been raped. And they seemed obsessed with protection, but not protection of their clients, people who've been raped, protecting, as you say, the exposure of the actual biology
of biological sex.
Yeah,
yes.
of the people working at the center, because it would be super traumatizing for a gender fluid, non-binary rape counselor to be outed as just a plain old vanilla regular woman, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's an additional bit to it, which is that J.K. Rowling, the author, of course, it comes into the story because
of course she does.
So J.K. Rowling decided that given the appalling things were happening at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, she decided to set up and provide most of the funding for an alternative rape crisis centre in Edinburgh, which she called Beera's Place, and that this would actually be women treating women. So very, very clear, going back to the old idea of what a rape crisis centre did. So the news that this centre had been funded and was about to open was revealed in December. I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 22. Anyway, the internal documents that were released to the employment tribunal show that this caused incredible consternation and rage at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. And the non-binary member of staff described it as something like, this news is a festive stinker, and suggested that they all get together so that they could rage about the founding of this alternative Rape Crisis Centre. Now, you and I might think that given Midel, Wadworth, and the people who supported her didn't want to actually counsel the bigoted rape victims who had the wrong ideas, you might think that they were very happy that there was a place to send them all, but not at all. They were furious. And in fact, Midel Wadworth was so angry that she decided not to refer people on to this other centre, not to actually say, we can't treat you, but you could go here.
Was Midel surrounded by these fellow travelers, by these like-minded ideologues at the time Midel got the job? Or did Midel, you sometimes see this in organizations, that there's a new CEO and they bring in all their own people. Was it like that before, where there's all these non-binary people obsessed with being protected from non-binary phobia or whatnot?
I don't know the answer to that, but the tribunal was very, very clear in its judgment that most of the staff at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre agreed with Midel Wadworth, and that they were absolutely adamant that biological sex is not important and that what matters is gender identity. They were very hostile to anybody who thought biological sex was important, which is, of course, the position that Ros Adams took.
There is a completely separate scandal. I guess this is the third scandal if we're counting. And this one, it's not clear to me how this figured into the decision to finally suspend Midel. But there was a fellow by the name of Cameron Downing, can't even guess what pronouns he's using now, a non-binary former drama student who somehow ingratiated himself into the apparatus of the Scottish National Party.
He was an equalities officer.
All the while, he was sexually abusing people of both sexes, apparently. And he gushed about the great treatment he got at Midel Center. Can you tell us this person's story?
So, as you say, he's former drama student, but something like 24, 25. And he did ingratiate himself with the Scottish National Party. He was photographed with people like Sturgeon. He used they that he's a man, but he used they them pronouns, which is manna from heaven apart as far as the SNP is concerned.
Right.
And he presented himself at the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre as a victim of sexual violence and was accepted as a client. And he had several months of counselling to help him deal with the trauma of what he had suffered. He started abusing both men and women. He blackmailed a young man into having sex with him by threatening to tell his friends and employer that this man had raped him unless he agreed to sex. He appeared in court last month. He was convicted of a number of charges, including physical and sexual assault. He was given 6 years in prison with a further 3 years on licence. And some of the gender critical people in the Scottish National Party, like the former MP Joanna Cherry, are very angry about this because they say that for ages they were trying to warn the SNP that this young man was a predator and that their warnings weren't heeded. The SNP say that as soon as they realised that there were these accusations against him, that they dropped him as an equalities officer and so on. But the fact remains, the central fact in this is that a rape crisis centre set up to counsel female victims of sexual violence became so trans inclusive that it accepted a young man who turned out to be a sexual predator as one of its service users. It's kind of a story you couldn't make up.
This person, Downing, 2 years ago, he tweeted that he wanted to, quote, beat the fuck out of some TERFs and transphobes, end quote. And as most listeners will know, TERF is it's a term of abuse used by activists to attack anybody who believes in the reality of biological sex. And then in another tweet, he wrote, I fucking hate TERFs and transphobes with such a passion. Was this at the time that he was still in the in-group with the SNP?
Yes. And I think the SNP have said that as soon as his tweets were drawn to their attention, that's when they cut their ties with him. I think that's what they said.
One minor character here is Joanna Cherry. It sounds like she was, call it a conscientious objector within the SNP.
Before she became a Westminster MP, she spent her career prosecuting rape cases and domestic violence cases. So she knows this subject inside out. And she was absolutely horrified by the direction that the SNP were going in. There have been a number of cases of SNP members threatening her with rape and murder. I think a couple of people have actually been prosecuted and gone to prison. She was the subject of a huge campaign by transgender-friendly SNP members who complained about her all the time. I think the only reason the party didn't actually do anything about her was the fact that she had an equal number of complaints about the way that she'd been treated and the violence that she'd been threatened with. And I think I know Joanna quite well. She's a friend of mine. And I think her view is that, she's always been on the left. She's always been a nationalist. And she doesn't recognise this iteration of the SNP, particularly under Nicola Sturgeon. She's much more aligned with the former leader, Alex Salmond. And her view, I think, is that the SNP took a terrible wrong turn in terms of allying itself with all this gender identity nonsense. And I think she felt, why should she be forced out of a party she'd supported all her life? But it certainly wasn't comfortable for her. And she is very angry about the fact that Cameron Downing wasn't actually thrown out of the party much earlier.
So Nicola Sturgeon's been out of power, and her ouster, if that's the right word, was reported maybe in the back pages of North American newspapers. It wasn't clear to me how central the issue of her gender extremism was, because this was around the time when I think there was this infamous case of a man who presented as a woman named Isla something or other.
Isla Bryson.
Yeah, so like a notorious, horrible, violent rapist, and Nicola Sturgeon could not give a straight answer to the media. I mean, it was like a circus that went on for weeks where she was asked point blank by interviewers who were admirably forthright, should this person belong in a woman's prison, yes or no? Nicola Sturgeon gave, ridiculous dilatory speeches about who knows what. How central was this issue to Nicola Sturgeon stepping down as leader? At least in the New York Times, some of the articles barely mentioned
Oh no,
the
it
scandal?
was absolutely central. So she resigned at the beginning of last year. So in December 2022, she steered this ridiculous bill through the Scottish Parliament, which would have allowed self-ID, so that any man could simply pop up and say, I'm now a woman, and get what's called a gender recognition certificate saying that his gender was female. And that would allow him to get a new birth certificate saying he'd been born female. And he didn't have to have any gender reassignment surgery, nothing like that. At the moment, you can't get that certificate until you've lived in your new identity for 2 years and you've had 2 diagnoses of gender dysphoria. What the Scottish National Party and the Greens were trying to do was sweep away all of those safeguards and say that anybody above the age of 16 could simply declare himself a woman and would have to be legally treated as a woman. And they were warned repeatedly. There were attempts to change the bill. So there were attempts to put in safeguards to say that a man who'd been accused of rape could not change his gender. The SNP and the Greens were so set upon this that they actually voted down even those kind of safeguards, and with, I'm afraid, support from Scottish Labour Party. So that bill went through in the December to absolute outrage. And in January, it was a misfortune for the government that, this test case came up. So this man, who's called Adam something, he was accused of raping 2 women. And when he was in prison, he announced that he was a woman and he was changing his name to Isla Bryson. So he appeared in court, and the courts in this country are largely captured. So he was referred to as she. We've had any number of court cases in this country where the prosecutor will say, and did she then put her penis in you? So this man was treated in court as if he were a woman. And when he was convicted of the rapes, he was remanded to Cornton Vale, which is the women's prison in Stirling in Scotland. And there was an absolute outcry. And he was only there for one night before he was moved back into the male estate, put in a male prison where he should have been. But it actually showed the folly of Nicola Sturgeon supporting self-ID, because here you have a man accused of raping 2 women, and he's still allowed to be treated in court as though, his self-ID matters more. The fact that he presents himself as a woman matters more than the dignity of his victims. And in English and Scottish law, by the way, a woman can't commit rape. She can be an accessory to rape, but you actually have to have a penis to commit rape. So here is a man who's convicted of a crime only a biological man can commit, and the court is treating him as though he's a woman, and he's sent to a women's prison. So that really exploded in Nicola Sturgeon's face, and she faced, as you say, all these questions from people saying, well, is Isla Bryson actually a woman? And she and Sturgeon and other SNP and Green politicians got themselves into a terrible mess. And some of them then said, oh no, he was pretending, he was masquerading. And then we all said, yes, but we said that men would do this.
Right.
How do we know the difference between a man who's genuinely, if there is such a thing, transgender, and a male convict who wants to go into a women's prison because the conditions are easier? And so it played a huge amount in the fact that Nicola Sturgeon had to resign.
In April, you had the Cass Review, which is this 5-star blue chip meta study, effectively, of all the best science from not just Britain, but all around the world regarding pediatric gender transition, and sounded a very powerful note of caution against the transitioning of minors.
Yes.
Seems to have had a huge effect on British politics and policymaking. And even, as I understand, even in Scotland, which was not formally bound by the purview of the Cass Review, they have rolled back some of the absurd and dangerous excesses of the speedy transitioning of children. Did that play a role in Midel finally being suspended from CEO of the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre? Like, are things turning around?
I think his suspension was much more to do with the outcome of the employment tribunal, because Ros Adams, the employee who complained, she will be awarded her costs and also damages. So it's going to be it's going to be very expensive, the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. I think that had much more to do with Ridgel Wadler being suspended. But I think there's a change of atmosphere here in England and Scotland, not so much in Wales, which is very captured. But Cass reports certainly played a part, because suddenly you had this evidence-based report by a very senior paediatrician pointing that we don't know the long-term effect of giving puberty blockers to children, and it may have very, very adverse effects on them. The other thing that's changed is that it isn't just Ross Adams. There have been, I should think, getting on for a dozen court cases now where employers, including councils and the Arts Council England, all these organisations have been found to have discriminated against employees who hold a very simple common sense view that biological sex is immutable. So what's happening is that employers are beginning to realise that there is a cost to allowing this ideology to run riot through their organisations. There's a cost in terms of reputation, and a cost in terms of actually having to pay compensation to individuals. So I think things are turning round.
Joan Smith, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Her article is called Gaslighting Scottish Rape Victims in the Name of Trans Inclusion. It was published in Quillette on August 4th. We appreciate you talking to our listeners.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.